Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. We thank Casey for the opportunity to talk to you this morning about the work of the Victorian Local Government Grants Commission. Just by way of starting, if I could say that we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we each live and work, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and that we draw inspiration from their traditional care for the land, water and air, and join them in protecting these for all Victorians now and in the future. Thank you for allowing me to say that. This morning, we'll run through a little agenda, starting with welcome and introductions, an opportunity for the Council to make a presentation. I will then talk about the Commission's role and a bit of an overview. Colin Morrison, our Executive Officer, will talk in some more detail about the general purpose grants and local roads grants. At the end, I'll ask Michael Ulrich, one of our commissioners, to speak to a slide on grant outcomes and talk a little bit about what's been happening to the pool of funds over time. Okay, so with that, Julia, you've got control of our slide, have you?
Certainly have, John. Ready to go when you are.
Okay, so just bring up the first slides.
Okay. This might take a minute while the screen is sharing. And this is the one we want.
Just while Julia is doing that, yes. If you just go to the third slide, Julia, thank you.
Yeah.
And
okay.
Get there. So, okay, so that's the Commission. Myself as chair in the middle of that photo, and my fellow commissioners, Michael Ulrich and Julie Eisenbys. Just by word of a little bit about ourselves, Michael's a very experienced and successful local government, former CEO in local government, and sits on a number of boards and audit and risk committees, particularly in local government. Julie Eisenbys, who unfortunately has to be an apology this morning, a former councillor and mayor, City of Manningham, worked for many years in the higher education sector, and currently sits as the chair of the panel of administrators of the South Gippsland Shire Council. Myself, a former local government CEO, former head of local government Victoria, 4 years as the chair of the panel of administrators at Brimbank City Council, and I also sit on a number of boards and audit and risk committees. We supported ably by our Executive Officer, Colin Morrison from Local Government Victoria, and our staff, Julia and Nada, who do all the work behind the scenes. Thanks, Julia. So, I think with that, we might hand back to the Council for your presentation. And I understand your acting Chief Executive Officer is going to do that, Nolene.
Yes, thank you, John. Oh, Nolene, you're on mute.
So we're in your hands for a little while.
Thank you, John. And on behalf of the City Case, I'd like to welcome the Victorian Local Government Grants Commission today. This meeting has been live streamed on Council's social media platforms, and I'd also like to thank Chair of the Administrator Panel, Nolene Duff, and fellow Administrator Miguel Belmar for joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge Sheena Frost, who's our Director of Corporate Services, who's here, Bernard Rowan, who's our CFO, and Kerry New, who's our Acting Director of City Planning and Infrastructure, and other council staff who are working behind the scenes to make this happen today. Like you, John, I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners, council's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pay respects to their elders, both past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. I wanted to spend some time this morning sharing with the Commission information that we think is insightful regarding our community here at Casey, and also some of the challenges and opportunities that we can see as a council. The timing of this meeting is welcomed. Later this month, on the 18th of May, we'll be presenting to our Administrative Panel a draft community vision, council plan, action plan, and associated budget information. These integrated strategic planning documents will build upon our Shape Your City deliberative engagement program and will be available for community engagement and consultation later this month. We have an aspiration that the council will adopt these documents later in June, following further contributions from the community over the next month or so. So as you can see, Casey's got a rich history and it's categorised by growth and diversity. Our community spans across almost 400,000 square kilometres, and we have established communities like Berwick and Cranbourne, and then we've got emerging communities across a number of new estates such as Minter Farm, Smiths Lane and Orana. The city of Casey is one of the fastest growing regions in Australia. We have more than 360,000 residents from around 150 different cultural backgrounds. And we're home to one of the largest number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents in Metro Melbourne. A high number of our residents are from refugee or asylum seeker backgrounds. Residents speak over 140 different languages, and we have more than 120 faiths. So our community is ever changing. It's something we grapple with every day. Our city is characterised by strong population growth, but our competitive advantages are broader than that, and they cover a range of sectors, including construction, health, and education. So we know we need to evolve with our communities if we want to be here for them in the long term. We acknowledge that there is an important need for us to make operations sustainable and to become truly resilient as an organisation. You'll see on this slide that's just come up, it really highlights what's happening on a day-to-day basis in council. Even despite the challenges of COVID, you can see that the lot settled to date in 2021 is above 5,500, with further developments continuing to be lodged and issued on a daily basis. I mean, this calendar year, we've seen a really sharp increase in development activity, which has been great, and we hope that continues to grow over the coming years. Our dwelling certification metrics are also returning to trend, and they're above 1920 levels, where COVID hit it pretty hard last year with the shutdowns. You know, we're yet to see the full sense of what COVID normal looks like, and we're very mindful that the story of growth is not representative of everyone's experience at Casey. We're also very aware the impact of changes to immigration, and when and how they'll be felt on our city is a bit unknown. Casey is the home to a diverse population that are at the forefront of some quite significant economic challenges, and the community is really being tested for their resilience. We're seeing this firsthand on a number of different fronts, especially in our service provision space. So I touched on before that we undertook some deliberative engagement as part of developing our city vision and council planning documents. So the key insights are on your screen now, and I just want to go through some of the particular elements of them. So population growth will change. So it will change in volume, but more likely it will change in makeup. The size of our daytime population is likely to change by potentially 10,000 people per day by 2030 as a result of different working from home conditions being normalised. But it's not just the nature of the growth in the spread of population that moves to Casey that creates specific challenges. It's how we provide services to this diverse and growing community. Our local economy has been characterised by job growth coming from population-dependent sectors such as construction, retail, hospitality, and healthcare social assistance. These cohorts are being challenged, and this is demonstrated by about 46% of our local businesses applied for and were on job seeker support in 2020. Only 45 local government areas in Australia had high application rates. So retail was our largest sector going into COVID. It is now second. It's been surpassed by healthcare and social assistance. Casey benefits from key health and education centres, which include Federation Uni, Chisholm TAFE, Monash Health and St John of God Hospital. We think that this positions us well as a community to pivot and grow in sectors that have more longevity. Our economic recovery will need to be guided by interventions that make the most sense of where our support and assistance can create the greatest value for the community and job creation on a sustainable level. Perhaps the greatest awareness that has emerged from COVID is the spotlight that has been shone on vulnerability. Cohorts of Casey's community that were already experiencing high levels of disadvantage are likely to be most impacted by the social and economic consequences of COVID. This means that the demand for direct care and community assistance will continue to be high, and we've seen this increase over the last 6 to 12 months. Social isolation and the threat of poverty are unfortunately prevailing conditions that we're seeing on a daily basis. But for Casey, we've entered the pandemic last year with the levels of unemployment and economic vulnerability that are above the national average, and they continue to stay in that space. Climate change and its impact on our community is real, it's current, and affects all part of our community, and it is a talking point within the community as well. From the perspective of council services, we know that we are collecting more garbage than recyclables, and this trend is unsustainable, particularly when we move through the challenges in the local regulatory environment with the circular economy and container deposit schemes. We will need to be forefront of action that protects our precious environment. Our environment was one of the most highly regarded aspects when we engaged with the community recently. And finally, there is an undeniable growth in council services as a consequence of our growth, diversity, and economic retail realities. Our financial sustainability is the key to us being able to sustain that. So the challenge of growth is in a geographically large organisation like council is best demonstrated in a critical look at our balance sheet. Whilst Casey's 5.7 billion of total assets makes it one of the largest councils based on financial position, the underlying rate of growth in our population highlights concerning capacity to service the community and to sustain broadly similar levels of service over time. If we were only a growth council, then financial arrangements such as developer contribution schemes can be used to leverage activities towards providing critical infrastructure like roads, drainage, and public open spaces and facilities. However, the commercial and financial realities is that these schemes are only ever internalised a share of the cost of delivering infrastructure, and that the nature and timing of growth is hard to predict, and the annual budget cycle creates an internal tension between, on one hand, the need to renew and upgrade existing infrastructure, where the data shows a clear challenge in maintaining our asset condition and keeping up with our depreciation, especially in our established areas, whilst on the other hand, being ahead of the curve in growth, building infrastructure that emerging communities need to function in our society. Each budget cycle, we grapple with the challenge of how to best prioritise the importance of capital against the growing needs of community for our services. This metrics on the screen shows that relative to the other interface councils, our physical assets are serving a larger share of the population at more than twice the level across the state. So our funding sources are no doubt familiar to the Commission. We appreciate that our revenue numbers are higher than most, but they do take some unpacking. Less than half of our total revenue this year comes from rates, and from this pool, we allocate operating and a capital budget. We are very reliant on the grants for the partner delivery of assets and community programs such as MCH and other community care. Today's agenda is addressing the 21.4 million in grants from the Commonwealth distributed by the Victorian Local Government Grants Commission under the principles of horizontal fiscal equalisation. This represents our second largest source of untied funding that is utilised by council in the delivery of services across the community. The other points to be aware of is that the revenue outside these sources has been under considerable strain during COVID. You know, in 1920, 8.3 million in negative variances for fees, fines, charges and interest. And in 2021, our budget has included 10.5 million reduction in budgeted revenue relative to pre-COVID expectations. Finally, on the revenue front, whilst rates revenue is high at 211 million, since COVID, council has not taken legal action to recover unpaid rates or charge penalty interest. Rates in arrears balances are now 43.4 million, which is presenting a cash flow challenge for council. And just over 14,000 ratepayers, which is about 31% increase year on year, or over 11% of the number of our ratepayers are also in arrears. Our community is certainly feeling the challenges of COVID, and the adverse economic circumstances. But there is clearly an inherent tension in the nature that we deliver and the capacity and resilience of the community to make these rates payments. At Casey, we have developed a service catalogue, like many councils, that takes a holistic customer view of the services that council is delivering to the community. The catalogue seeks to ensure our services are designed and resourced to align with the organisation's strategy and sustainability and effectively meet the current and future demands of the community, in the community. This will over time integrate our planning and investment decisions. The service catalogue breaks down the distinction between services and catalogues and highlights the types of activity that our community experiences, and in our view, represents the broad breakdown of an operating budget. We hold the view that growth is the key driving or impacting all our service areas. And in a rate-capped environment, we need to adapt and be more efficient in the way we deliver services to the community. But we contend that growth affects all our service offerings, whereas under the equalisation principles that the Grants Commission operates under, population growth is only assumed to affect a subset of our service offering. We are really curious about this issue and how this view has developed over time and influences your thinking. So finally, before I hand it back to the Commission, ahead we here at Casey put forward 2 questions that we look forward to discussing later in the meeting. Our questions relate to the question of growth and also the consideration that the Grants Commission has with respect to COVID and the impacts on all councils. We would also be really pleased as the leadership team here at Casey to assist the Commission in any other way if you have any thoughts or requests from us. So thank you, John, and thank you, Michael. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation, James. As is usually the case when councils make a presentation, it reinforces much of the knowledge and understanding that the Commission already has from its own collection of data, but it's useful to hear it firsthand. In terms of the several questions you asked, I think we'll address those as we go through our presentation, and with that, we'll go straight into our presentation. So, Julia, we could bring up slide 5, I think. There we go. Okay, so look, the Commission does collect a lot of data, but we also provide a lot of information back to our local government community. So this slide, if you look to the top left-hand corner, we provide each year a customised report for every council. In your case, detailing Casey's allocation, the payment schedule, and the grant calculations that sit behind it. In the top right-hand corner, the allocations report. Like local government, the Commission has a new piece of legislation. So our annual report, as it was formerly referred to, is now an allocation report. And in there, as a written document, tabled in Parliament, it sets out our activities, our methodology, and all of the data that sits behind all the council calculations. The bottom left-hand corner, the snapshot, single A4 piece of paper. On one side, a snapshot of the Commission, and on the other, in your case, a snapshot of our understanding and assessment of Casey. And finally, the Commission website, where all of the data that we collect is available in a form that councils individually, collectively can use to make comparisons and manipulate to see how they fare in the scheme of things in terms of the outcomes of these grants. We also collect data that we don't actually use on behalf of the ABS, and that's done so that it avoids duplicate requests to councils, and that's available as well. Thanks, Julia. So a little about the Commission itself. We are an independent statutory authority. We have an Act of Parliament in Victoria, and our role is to make recommendations each year on the financial assistance grants that are provided by the Commonwealth Government to Victorian councils. So we make recommendations through the Victorian Minister for Local Government up to the Commonwealth Minister. The financial assistance grants are allocated in two components, the first being the general purpose grants, and these are allocated between the states and territories by the Commonwealth according to population share, and I'll touch on that further. The second is the local roads grants, and they're distributed by the Commonwealth to each state and territory on a fixed share basis, a percentage that hasn't changed for many, many years. The allocations are guided by a set of national distribution principles that James touched on, and I'll refer a little bit more to those in a moment. Importantly, this funding is not tied in the hands of the Council. It's not tied to any specific purpose. It is allocated by the Commission, our recommendations, between Victoria's councils on a formula basis, which we describe as reflecting the relative needs of each of our councils. And finally, on this slide, all the funding that comes from the Commonwealth passes through to local government. So any administrative costs associated with the Commission itself are borne by the Victorian government. Thanks, Julia. So those national distribution principles, there are 7. The first 6 relate to the general purpose grants and the final one to roads. So just quickly touching on them. Number 1, horizontal equalisation. A difficult term to get your head around, but we simplify that by describing that as the relative needs of councils, one versus the rest of them in Victoria. Second, the so-called minimum grant. That's a requirement enshrined in the Commonwealth legislation that 30% of the average grant on a per capita basis must go to every council. And the third, effort neutrality. We describe this as the requirement by the Commission to be blind to local policy decisions. So I know it's less relevant now in a rate capping environment, but when councils were able to set their rates increases, what they saw fit each year, that's a local policy decision, and those decisions are still inside the current calculations and position of each council. If you decide to build a new swimming pool or a new facility, whatever, that's a local policy decision. So the Commission, we are blind to those things, and Colin will explain that more. We have to recognise other grant support, that's number 4. Number 5, the recognition of the needs of Indigenous people. And number 6, and not relevant at the moment, is the maintenance of grants for a number of years to amalgamated councils. The 7th is the one that relates to the local roads grant, and it's simply one principle to be allocated to councils based on an assessment of the preservation of the council's road assets. And moving on, so for 2020-21, the amounts coming to Victoria from the Commonwealth, general purpose grants, a little shy of $462.5 million, an increase of 1.5% for Victoria. Important to note that the national pool grew by 0.9%. So Victoria did a little better than other jurisdictions, and that's because of our population. And in brackets there, it says 26.1% of Australian total. So at the point in time when these allocations were finalised by the Commonwealth, Victoria's population represented 26.1% of the Australian total. And it's places like Casey with population growth that contribute to that. The second, the local roads grants, $162.2 odd million, an increase of 0.9%, exactly the growth in the national pool. And the 20.6% of the Australian total is that fixed share that's been the case for many, many years. Bringing your total Victoria's total allocation to $624.676 million, and put it all together, it's about 1.4% improvement over the previous year. Now, each year the Commonwealth do look back and they make an adjustment for the final inflation numbers in the previous year. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. This time they assessed that Victoria had received an overpayment in the previous year of about $2.5 million. So that comes off and brings us to our final cash position of $622.103 million. Now, there's a little note at the bottom there. Natural disaster grants of $660,000 are included in the general purpose grants. Uniquely in Victoria, the Commission takes off the top of the general purpose grants an amount to assist councils that had had a finalised natural disaster. And when a council has that experience of eligible expenditure that they are able to claim back from the state and the Commonwealth, there's always an amount of up to $35,000 that they can't claim. It's like an excess, and the Commission in Victoria, we essentially, when it's all settled, we provide that excess back to the council off the top of these grants. So thank you, Julia. So we drill down now to Casey for 2020-21. Your general purpose grant, $18.641 million, an increase of 3.4%, much better than the state increase. And again, clearly as a result of your population growth. Your local roads grant, $2.771 million, an increase of 4.2%, reflecting obviously your increasing local roads lengths. So your total allocation, $21.412 million, an increase of 3.5 over the previous year. And it's worth noting that that amount that Casey receives is the second highest monetary grant from this source in Victoria, the highest being Geelong. Your share of the overpayment brings the cash payment back to $21.318 million. The next slide, this little graph is a way of depicting what's been happening with Casey's grants over a period of time going back to 2011-12, and you know, it's been a pretty steady increase. But in the middle there, you'll notice both the general purpose grant on the left and the local roads on the right, and the total, sorry, the middle and the total on the right. There's a bit of a flat period in the middle there, and that's pretty much when the Treasurer at the time took a decision to freeze the national pool of these grants for 3 years, and that's reflected in the outcomes of grants. Okay, so map of Victoria. Now this is not how we allocate the grants. It's a picture way of interpreting the grants after the allocation calculations are all made, but it shows these financial assistance grants as a percentage of councils, each council's recurrent revenue. So in the case of Victoria, on average, all councils, it's 6.2%. In the case of Casey, it's 5.9%. If you look to the colour coding, we have the yellow up to 5% of recurrent revenue, essentially around Melbourne and down to the Mornington Peninsula, and that includes the minimum grant councils that I mentioned when I discussed the principles. As we move out into the browny orange colour, or it might be pink on your screen, it's between 5 and 10%, and we move, and of course that's where Casey sits. We move into the lighter blue, 10 to 15%, darker blue, 15 to 20%, light green, 20 to 25%, and then the darker green in the west of the state plus Townsville in the northeast. These grants represent, in their case, 25% or more of recurrent revenue. And West Wimmera on the South Australian border, it is significantly more. And it is a way of depicting the, certainly in rural and regional Victoria, the very great dependence of councils on these funds. They're important to all councils, but without these monies, those councils would be in dire straits. So moving to the next slide, you asked or mentioned COVID in your questions. So the downturn in the economy resulting from the pandemic has certainly negatively impacted the annual increase in the pool of grants that come from the Commonwealth. So that 0.9% growth that I mentioned for 2020-21, we would usually expect to see an increase in the pool coming to Victoria of 3.3 to 4%. So a dramatic reduction, and it's very much a result of COVID-19. It's important though that COVID-19 has not impacted the relative grant outcomes as between councils for 2021, as the data that was used by the Commission was predominantly from the 2018-19 financial year, pre-COVID. Notwithstanding that, to support financial stability and undue volatility in grant outcomes, particularly for those small rural councils, the Commission did limit movements in grant outcomes, and Colin will mention that. We are obviously very concerned about the impact of COVID as we go forward in future years, and we're doing a lot of thinking, a lot of head scratching about that at the moment. And already in the collection of data for 2019-20, we asked councils to make a change in relation to local roads data. We've had to reduce our meetings with councils, obviously, and like today, and also our regional council meetings have all been held virtually. And the Commission, I haven't seen my colleagues in person since April 2020, but we are hoping in the very near future that we will be able to meet again in the one room. A little about payments before I hand over to Colin. A payment of about 50% of the total for each council was made on the 26th of May 2020, brought forward by the Commonwealth. The remaining funding for equal instalments, you've had 3 of those, and the final one will be paid this month. As I mentioned, we have an annual series of regional information sessions, and the final point there, and I think it does go somewhat towards your questions as well, we invite and encourage all councils to give consideration to making a written submission to the Commission. If you believe that there is something that might improve the methodology, improve the formula, we want to hear about it. We suggest you talk to the Commission staff first, because it might be something that work's been done on before, but certainly we'd want to see council thoughts and ideas. It's those things and discussions like we're having today and the regional sessions we have, plus self-initiated work by the Commission, that has over time, over successive commissions, brought the methodology to where it is today. We don't make changes every year, but when we do, it's often as a result of these discussions or submissions from councils. Now, I'm about to hand over to Colin, but just at that point, perhaps just pause for a moment. Are there any questions or comments that anybody would like to make at that point? Nothing coming forward? Okay, so Colin, we'll press on. Now, Colin will now take us through a bit more detail of two components of the grants. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, John, and a very good morning to everyone. Particular thanks to you, James, for a great presentation there, giving us a bit of an overview of some of the key issues facing Casey at the moment. As James and Nolene would be aware, I've been a fairly frequent visitor to Casey in recent times with another hat on, and so been witnessing firsthand some of the incredible growth that's just taking place there. So look, I'll move through this next part of the presentation just to provide a bit more information about the general purpose grant stream of funding and then the local roads grant stream of funding, to provide a bit more information about the sorts of things that the Commission does take into account when these funds are being allocated each year, and in particular what is driving the grant outcomes for Casey across those 2 pools of funding. And we'll certainly make sure we get to those issues and questions that James posed a little earlier. And as we go through, we'll pause at a couple of key points for any questions or discussion. But if I could just start with the general purpose grants stream of funding, as John said before, the Commission had available to it this year about $462 million of funding to make recommendations to the Commonwealth as to how that funding be allocated between Victorian councils. John talked before about the national principles. The key principle that applies here is that the Commission is required to allocate those funds between the 79 Victorian councils based on our assessment of the relative needs of each council. So essentially, each year we go through an exercise that compares your needs on a relative basis to the needs of the other 78 councils to determine what share of that available pool of funding you should receive. Now, that assessment takes into account an assessment of each council's expenditure needs, but on a relative basis, and I'll work through how we do that, and an assessment of each council's capacity to raise revenue from two key sources, rates and user fees and charges, but again, on a relative basis. Also, as I'll go through, the Commission's allocation formula does take into account a range of data about each council's population, valuation base, and a range of characteristics, local characteristics, including factors, we will touch on this, such as population growth, population dispersion, socioeconomic disadvantage, etc. But before I get to that, if we can just go on to the next slide, I just wanted to give a quick snapshot of the spread of grant outcomes across the state. So I suppose essentially jumping to the end to look at the outworkings of the operation of our allocation formula. The grants coming into Victoria for this year, for 2021, $462 million, were equivalent to an average of just on $70 per capita for Victoria. Now, population is one of the most significant drivers, if not the most significant driver of our grant outcomes, but there are a range of other factors that come into play as well. And because the Commission does take into account all of those factors, we do end up with a spread of grants that, when divided back by population, go a long way below and a long way above that state average of $70 per capita. One end of the spectrum, we have 16 councils, all in the inner metropolitan area and out into the eastern suburbs, that receive the so-called minimum grant that John alluded to before. That's a requirement of the Commonwealth, that all councils in Victoria, indeed all councils nationally, must receive a grant that is at least 30% on a per capita basis of the state average, or $21 this year. So 16 councils, all in the inner metropolitan area, we would assess as having relatively low needs compared to other councils in the state. Their grants have to be at that level. The other end of the spectrum, the grant outcomes go all the way up to a high of over $900 per capita now. A grant that in total terms of $3.7 million, and this is for West Wimmera Shire to put a name to it, is significantly less than the grant to Casey, but certainly on a per capita basis is far more. And you can see there, Casey's grant sits a little below the state average. Now, if we can go on to the next slide, this is just another way of demonstrating those same outcomes. Again, this is not how we allocate the grants, but this just shows the outworkings of the grants that we determine divided back by population. So a little similar to the map that John put up before, that this is just showing the general purpose grant outcomes on a per capita basis and the range of those outcomes across the state. So we start in the inner metropolitan area, the 16 so-called minimum grant councils. As I said, they are the councils we would assess as having the lowest relative needs, therefore receive that minimum grant. They're surrounded by 5 or 6 councils that then receive grant outcomes slightly above the minimum grant, at less than $50 per capita. And then finally, for the metropolitan area, a number of the interface councils, including Casey, and also Greater Geelong there as well, receiving grant outcomes in that $50 to $75 range. And if you recall, that state average of $70 is at the upper end of that range. As you go outside of the metropolitan area, you start to very quickly see grant outcomes that go above, and then in many cases well above, that state average. Head up through the blue shading, so the darker blue takes us up to $250 per capita, and then into the green shaded councils that take us from above $250, ending up with a group of 6 councils across the Wimmera and Southern Mallee, plus Towong in the northeast, the councils that receive over $500 per capita. But if you just focus for a moment on that group of 6 councils, the common factors at play there are very small populations. I think each of them has a population of less than 8,000 people. Very large areas, each of them individually is about the size of metropolitan Melbourne. Very significant issues around a highly dispersed population, remoteness, socioeconomic disadvantage, very long lengths of local road that they're responsible for, and critically, very low rate bases. They're all the things that tick boxes for us in terms of our assessment of relative needs. So we would assess those councils as having the highest relative needs of any councils in the state. So this map, as well as showing that spread of grant outcomes across the state, is also showing the spread, if you like, of the Commission's assessment of relative needs across councils, going from the lowest, being the yellow shaded councils in inner Melbourne, through to the highest, being those darkest green shaded councils. Okay, so what I've done there is effectively jump to the end, given you the results. Just want to give you a little bit more information now about what determines those results. So if we go to the next slide, please, Julia. What the Commission does each year, as I said, is go through really a two-part assessment. Assessment of each council's relative expenditure needs and an assessment of each council's relative capacity to raise revenue from rates and from user fees and charges. And I'll provide a bit more information about each of those two factors in each of those two calculations shortly, but just bear in mind that it's actually the difference between those two calculations, or the gap, if you like, that actually determines the share of the available pool of funding, the $462 million that your council receives. So really what we're asking ourselves is, to what extent do your expenditure needs on a relative basis outstrip your revenue raising capacity, again, on a relative basis? So a little now about each of those two equations. So firstly, with expenditure needs. When the Commission goes through its allocation process each year, and we're now well into this process for the 21-22 year, and look at council's relative expenditure needs, we do so on the basis of 9 different areas of recurrent expenditure, which between them take into account all aspects of recurrent expenditure across all Victorian councils. So we'll do a calculation separately for, say, family and community services, for recreation and culture, for waste management, for business and economic services. So 9 different areas of service delivery. And for each of those calculations for each council, there's really 3 key inputs. The first is, what is the relative size of the task that your council has compared to other councils in delivering that task? So if we say, take the example of recreation and culture, your parks and gardens, sporting facilities, library services, etc. The relative size of the task we use there is population. All else being equal, we would expect a council with a larger population to have a larger task and therefore a higher level of expenditure in relation to providing services in that area. So for many of our functions, or areas as we call them, population will be the major driver or the major indicator of the relative size of the task. In some of those areas, we do modify the population. For very small councils, we will build in some minimum or base populations for some of the areas. For some of the areas, we also take into account the impact of non-permanent populations as well. But ultimately, the major driver there is population. The second factor then is, what is the actual level of expenditure by councils on that function, but averaged across the state. So we know last year, for example, that the average level of expenditure across the state on recreation and cultural services was about $312 per capita. So that's the information that we use there. But if we just stopped at that point, we'd be saying that the Casey's relative expenditure needs for, say, recreation and culture would be the size of your population, your 350, 360,000 people, multiplied by the statewide average level of expenditure. But we wouldn't at that stage be saying anything about the nature of Casey as a municipality or the nature of the communities that you serve. So that's why we spend a lot of time here in this last box and build in information about the relative nature of the task. What is it about the nature of the task that you face in servicing your population that makes it more expensive or perhaps less expensive on a per capita basis to provide services to your community? So we could just stick with that bottom box for a minute and go on to the next slide. How we do that within our formula is to use a series of what we call cost adjusters, or local characteristics, if you like. And we use the same common set of 12 characteristics across all councils, but we then look to see what the data is for each council compared to the average Victorian council. So 12 factors down the left-hand side of the screen there, a lot of it demographic related, population growth, population aged under 6 years, etc. But also some other measures there as well: socioeconomic disadvantage, tourism, and English-speaking proficiency or language there. You can see there where there are some factors above one, and you can certainly see the standout ones for Casey, and no surprise to us and certainly no surprise to yourselves, I suggest: population growth and its very close relation. The proportion of your population aged under 6 years are well above the state average of 1, and really indicating to us in terms of our outcomes that is a unique factor, if you like, for Casey, and something that is driving your costs and therefore needs to be reflected in our formula. Similarly, English-speaking proficiency or language, certainly above the state average. And the current data for socioeconomic disadvantage is showing that to be, above the state average as well, but bearing in mind that that is census data from the 2016 census, and we'll obviously be revisiting that after the census later this year. So some factors there that are indicating need above 1, but similarly, some factors there indicating some lesser need or some needs below the state average. Again, the standout one there is a measure of economies of scale. Clearly, with the largest population of any council in the state, you have access to economies of scale that, say, small rural councils certainly don't in terms of their service delivery. So that's a consideration within our formula as well. So 12 factors there, using the data for Casey and comparing you to the state average. The next question is, how do we reflect that in our formula? And with this slide, apologies for the detail here. I'm not quite sure what size screens you're looking at, but there is a fair bit of detail on the screen. So I'll just give you a bit of an overview of this, because this really is, if you like, the engine room of how we determine the relative expenditure needs for councils. Down the left-hand side of the page, we have listed the 9 areas of expenditure that we do a calculation for each year. So, as I said before, family and community services, recreation and culture, waste management, etc. If you jump across to the right-hand side, you'll see in the green there the measure of the relative size of expenditure for each council, the relative size of the task rather, which, as I said before, in most cases is population or some variation of that, although in the case of waste management, we take the number of dwellings. So that's the one raw indicator of relative expenditure needs for each of those areas. But in the middle of the slide, we modify it or adjust it, if you like, depending on where you sit in relation to the various cost adjusters that we take into consideration for each of those areas of expenditure. So you'll see listed across the top of the slide there in the dark blue, the same 12 cost adjusters we had on the previous slide. And if you work down the slide in terms of its rows, you'll see where we apply different combinations of those cost adjusters with different weightings to each of those areas of expenditure. So again, using the example of, say, recreation and culture there in the middle, our starting point will be council's population, modified by non-permanent residents, if appropriate, but then overlaid with where Casey sits in relation to a basket of 4 weighted cost adjusters, being language, population dispersion, regional services, and tourism. And I'd have to say, if you go back to the previous slide, for the language, certainly a little above the statewide average of 1, for population dispersion, regional services, and I expect tourism, if we went back to it, a little below the state average of 1. So we take really there a weighted average of those 4. Now, I have to say that this slide applies to all councils in the state. We don't have a different application of cost adjusters for different councils in the state. We use your unique data from the previous slide, but then apply it to all councils using this formula. Now, coming back to one of the questions James posed a little earlier, was about the impact of population growth. You can certainly see as you look down this chart in terms of the columns, that some of the cost adjusters are represented or used more frequently than are others. Population growth, you'll see, is utilised across 3 of the areas of expenditure, being family community services, traffic and street management, and the environment function. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not ignoring your population size or the increase in the population from year to year, because as I said in the green column there, the major driver for each of those areas of service, with the slight exception of waste management, is your population size. And as your population grows, that growth is naturally reflected in that data. But just bearing in mind that we are always looking slightly in the rearview mirror, here we're taking data that has a lag of a year or so. We do recognise that we're not quite picking up all of that, that impact of population growth. So the Commission has for several years now also included population growth as a cost adjuster as well across those 3 areas of service delivery. So it really has a bit of a secondary impact, I suppose. Do take your point, James, that population growth will inevitably affect all of your areas of service delivery. And we often get arguments from councils in areas of, say, high tourism, for example, that tourism affects all of the areas of service delivery as well. Now, the Commission is not saying here that population growth doesn't have an impact across all your areas of service delivery. The reality is what we're trying to drill down to is the 4 or 5, maybe I think in one case, 6 major, most significant impacts on each of these areas of service delivery, not all of the impacts. The reality is that if we took into case all of the impacts, we'd very quickly get to a point here where we had yellow shading right across this entire chart, and very quickly bringing all councils back to the statewide average of 1 through this. So we're really trying to differentiate between councils based on the most significant impacts on their cost structures. So I'll just give you a very quick worked example of how this all comes into play, and then we'll stop for any discussion. So just looking at a quick worked example for Casey, what we've done here is look at the relative expenditure needs in relation to your family and community services area. So one of the 9 areas of service delivery. So I said before, 3 inputs into this. Firstly, your population for last year's calculations. This would have been your population as of June 2019, a little over 353,000 people. That's then multiplied by the statewide average level of expenditure of about $136 per capita, but then adjusted by the various cost adjusters applying to family and community services. One of the key ones there, we won't go back to the previous slide, but one of the key ones there is proportion of population aged under 6 years. So we take where Casey sits in relation to the basket of cost adjusters we use for family and community services, and then apply the various weightings. And there we get what we call a composite or a combined cost adjuster of a little over 1.067, which is essentially saying, in layman's terms, we're recognising some additional need in Casey over and above that statewide average level of expenditure due to the impact of those cost adjusters, particularly population growth and proportion of population aged under 6 years. So essentially applying, in layman's terms, another 6.7% on top of that average statewide average level of expenditure. Calculating those 3 through, it gets us to a figure of about $51.6 million, being the Commission's assessment of relative expenditure needs for family and community services for Casey. Now, what we don't do at this point is go looking back to your budget from last year or the sort of information that James put up before to see whether that's what you're actually spending on family and community services. There'll be a whole range of reasons why your expenditure might be more than that, or it might be less than that. Often we're somewhat in the ballpark, but we're certainly, as John said before, not taking into account the sorts of policy decisions that you have to make across the council table every meeting, and predecessor councils have as well, which really determines to some extent the level of expenditure that you have on family and community services. What we're really trying to do is using these, all of these factors, all of this information is getting to a point where we can assess Casey's expenditure needs for family and community services against those of the other 78 councils, and then building that up across the other 8 functions to get to a total level of relative expenditure needs. Now, I'm going to talk shortly about the second part of this equation, which is the revenue side, but I will just pause briefly at this point because there's often questions or discussion, particularly around the cost adjusters or how we apply them. Anything there? If not, I will move on and it'll leave us some time.
Sorry, Colin.
Sorry, Nolene, yes.
It's probably forecasting your next set of slides, but I'm just trying to understand the relationship between the national distribution principles, in particular the third one around effort neutrality, relative to the revenue raising capacity, which actually takes into account rate, fees and charges, etc.
Yes, okay. I'll flag that as I go into the next part of the presentation, if you like. Thanks. If there's nothing else on this, I will go into the little bit of a discussion about the revenue side. Here on the revenue side, we're looking at relative capacity to raise revenue from 2 main sources, from your rate base and from your user fees and charges. In the interest of time today, I'm going to focus very much on the rate revenue raising calculation, but just want to also indicate in terms of user fees and charges, coming back a little to one of the points that James raised before, one of the things we do take into account in looking at capacity to raise revenue from user fees and charges is some local factors, again, socioeconomic disadvantage, but also some factors such as household income, etc., that modify, that we know will sort of act as a brake to some extent or other on a council's capacity to raise revenue from that source. But I will focus on rate revenue here, and this is getting a bit to the question that Nolene raised. We know here that we can't use a measure of council's actual rate revenue because despite the rate cap, which has now been in place for a number of years, the actual level of rate revenue for each council across Victoria is still impacted by policy decisions, that third national principle that John referred to before. It's really built up, the level of rates in Casey now is really built up from a series of decisions that councils have made over many years that have given you the rate levels and the rate base that you now have. And it's the same for all councils across the state. So what we do in this calculation to address that national principle is to step behind the rate revenue that you actually raise to the valuation base that you have access to raise those rates. And that's something over which council has, obviously still has some control and some policy impact, but certainly not to the extent that it does with rate revenue. So what we're doing here is to look behind the rate revenue to the valuation base that you have access to. I'll go straight to the next slide at this stage and show you the worked example here for the relative revenue raising capacity for Casey, the 2021 grants for the residential rate part of your base. So as I said before, we are focused here very much on your valuation base, and we take here the valuations of your residential properties, but averaged over the last 4-year period of about $53 million. I'd have to say, particularly for a growth council, the fact that we do average over a 4-year period is a bit advantageous because that's giving you a slightly, will give you a lower valuation base there in terms of the calculation I'm about to work through. So I figure there are $53 billion for Casey. The second thing we do is then multiply that, not by the residential rate in the dollar that Casey struck last year, but by the average residential rate applying across Victoria. And that's built up of obviously 79 different residential rates across the state and averages out to 0.28 cents in the dollar. Now, what we will always find is that councils in rural and regional Victoria, and to a large extent interface councils, will inevitably have actual rates in the dollar higher than that amount, and councils in the inner metropolitan area where valuations are higher and therefore rates in the dollar can be lower, are generally below that amount. So the application of a statewide rate of the dollar rather than your actual rate generates a result there that is some way below what you actually raised by way of your residential rates. And when I talk of residential rates, I am including a consideration of the waste charges in there as well, I should say. So in fact, giving a result there of a little over $151 million being our assessment of Casey's capacity to raise revenue on a relative basis from your residential rate base. So if we go to the next slide, that figure of $151 million is a component, and obviously the most significant component of that figure there in the blue box. We repeat that exercise for commercial industrial properties, for farm properties, and we bring in our assessment of user fees and charges, as I talked about before too. It gives us a total calculation of about $208 million. Now, obviously that figure would be higher if we took into account your actual rates, but you don't want that figure to be higher, I should say, because from council's point of view, you want to be maximising the gap between these two numbers. So the number there in the middle, $208 million, that's subtracted from our overall calculation of relative expenditure needs across the 9 functions we looked at before of about $329 million, and it was the family and community services function we looked at just a little while ago. So it gives you a quite significant gap of $121 million between those two calculations. So it's really a commission saying here that our assessment of your relative expenditure needs outstrips our assessment of your relative revenue raising capacity by $121 million. Now, unfortunately, for your budget purposes, that doesn't become your grant for the year. Once we go through this exercise across all 79 councils, we end up with total dollars there significantly more than $462 million that we have to allocate. So from that point, we adjust back or factor back to fit those amounts into the available funding of $462 million. This year, we've been able to fund about 15.5% of that gap for each council, giving the grant there of about $18.7 million for Casey for this year. There is a slight adjustment there at the end, which I'll go to in a minute. It's really due to the constraining mechanism we apply to increases and decreases in grant outcomes. So I think the next slide is the final one on general purpose grants before I do pause. I'll go to the last point first. As I said, the Commission did constrain movements in grant outcomes, general purpose grant outcomes for the 2021 year, largely because of both the limited increase in the overall pool for Victoria of only 1.5% this year, and also the fact that we received very late advice about that. So what the Commission did was 2 things. It applied an upper limit of 5% to increases in grant outcomes for all councils. And it also, recognising the significantly greater reliance that rural councils have on this stream of funding, it did insert a constraint such that all rural councils had to receive an increase of at least 1% compared to the previous year. So 2 constraints put in place. The other thing to note that last year too, we did make an adjustment which had a fairly minor flow-on effect for other councils to the rate revenue calculation for the councils most affected by the bushfires in summer of last year. Final thing just to note on this slide is the Commission does go through this full allocation process each year. We're currently working through that for the 21-22 grants and looking to be in the position of giving you some preliminary advice as to your grant outcome later in May after the federal budget. So going through that process now, bringing into account all of the latest expenditure, revenue and valuation data from councils, and particularly and critically for Casey, the most recent population data as well. So John, I'm going to pause there before I've got sort of 5-10 minutes to talk about local roads, but just sort of any questions or further discussion.
Thank you, Colin. Any questions or points to be made on what Colin just talked about? Anyone?
Just one on my poor listening skills. if I may, through you, John.
Breaking up a lot.
And that is, I thought you referenced the advantage to Casey in terms of the council's total valuation base is the, if you like, relative indicator in that assessing the needs. So I thought you said something about every 4 years and that being advantageous, Colin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps
So
I've
Julia,
read that wrongly.
No, Julia, if we could just go back to the slides, if it's possible. But I suppose what I was saying there is the valuation base that we utilise is currently averaged over a 4-year period. If you could just go back, I think 2 slides. Thanks, Julia. So
I think averaged was the word I missed.
Yeah. So you'll see there the valuation base we used to say your residential properties is $53 billion. Now that's a figure that's averaged over the last 4 years. In fact, it'll be even a bit longer. That'll be 2018, 19 and the 3 previous years. If we used your current valuations and only your current valuations, that would be, I would expect a much higher figure of, I would expect at least 60, if not $65 billion, given your growth during that time. That would give you a higher number in that bottom box, which would travel into the next slide and significantly reduce that gap between the two amounts and would reduce your grant outcome. So that $208 million, for example, might fall back to, I'm just guessing at numbers here, $180 million, for example. Would actually increase. Would be sort of $220–230 million and would reduce that net relative need and reduce the grant.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Otherwise, I'll ask Colin to move on to local roads.
Thanks, John. And this won't take us long, but I just wanted to run quickly through the second of the 2 streams of funding. We can go on to the next slide. Thanks, Julia. And that was about $162 million this year. So there is this second specific pool of funding for local roads. Now, as is required by the Commonwealth under the National Distribution Principles, the Victorian Commission allocates these grants based on what we assess the relative needs of each council to be in maintaining the local road network that you have responsibility for. The formula that we use takes into account the length of local roads in each municipality, critically, the traffic volumes carried on those local roads, and a range of, again, local characteristics. Here we're using factors such as climate, freight, subgrade conditions, etc. I'll talk about data sources in a minute, but we are reliant on road length and traffic volume data provided by councils. The other data, such as climate, freight, subgrade conditions, etc., is provided to us externally on a statewide basis. Quick note there about a constraint that the Commission did apply this year with an increase in the overall pool of only 0.9 of 1%. The Commission again acted such that no rural council received a grant reduction from this pool of funding for the 2021 year. I'll go straight to part of the calculation of the grant for Casey for this year. What we use in our calculation is 9 different categories of local road, 4 urban categories, 5 rural categories, differentiated by different traffic volume ranges. So with our urban local roads, for example, we have one category of roads carrying under 500 vehicles a day, another carrying 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, 5,000 plus. So really differentiated by traffic volumes. There's 3 inputs into this equation as well. So this is just one part of the overall calculation. This is for your urban local roads and those carrying under 500 vehicles a day. So the first component here is an indication of the length of road the council has in this category. And from the data you've provided us with, we use a figure there of 968 kilometres for Casey, being the length of urban roads that you have carrying under 500 vehicles a day. Jump across to the right-hand side there. We apply across the state an average, if you like, maintenance allowance at $7,200 per kilometre across the state for every kilometre of urban road carrying under 500 vehicles a day. In the middle of the slide there, that's where we apply these various factors such as climatic conditions. We do take account of what we call strategic routes, which is information provided by councils, which includes things such as bus routes. And 5 factors there, which we multiply through together to give us an overall cost modifier or adjustment, if you like, for Casey of 0.93. So our network cost, or if you like, the relative maintenance needs for Casey in relation to this category of local road, is therefore the length of road, 968 kilometres, a statewide average allowance of $7,200 per kilometre, multiplied by 0.93 to take account of those local factors. Gives us an overall network cost, or if you like, maintenance allowance for Casey of about $6.4 million. Now we then repeat that across the other 8 categories of local roads and take account of bridges on local roads as well. That takes us to the next slide where we get an overall network cost figure for Casey of about $16.4 million, built up of the separate calculation for each of those road categories. So that $16.4 million is, again, not particularly meaningful in its own right, but it does give us a basis on which we can say that the relative maintenance needs that Casey has in relation to its road network sit at this amount relative to the similar calculations for other councils. Again, in allocating the grants, we find we have much more here in the network cost calculation across the state than we have to allocate, the $162 million available. So again, we've factored back or scaled back to fit the available funding. And this year, that's given us the ability to fund 16.9% of that amount across all councils, or about a little under $2.8 million for Casey. Now, let's pause on that figure for a moment, just to stress that that figure is very important for Casey. It's very important for all councils. It's not only gives you your local roads grant for the year, it is a significant factor back in the general purpose grant calculation as well, which I skated over before, because expenditure on local roads and bridges is one of the 9 areas of expenditure within the general purpose grant model. For historical reasons, it has always been this way, despite the fact there is this separate stream of funding from the Commonwealth for local roads grants. So there is a link back to the general purpose grant outcome as well. These figures are also picked up by the Commonwealth and used to allocate funding through their Roads to Recovery program and their more recent local roads and community infrastructure program as well. So getting this number right is very important for us and it's very important for councils across the state. Now we go on to the next slide. A key factor in determining these grants is the roads data that we do receive from councils each year. And each year we are still seeing, despite the best efforts of the Commission, some considerable volatility in the roads data that councils are providing us with, both in terms of the length of road, but also the spread of the road network across the various traffic volume ranges. Now, obviously for councils, particularly growth area councils, that data will change and will change significantly from year to year. So both the length of road will increase, but also we'll start to see your roads move up the various traffic volume ranges, as well as the roads that you have carry more traffic. So there will be reasons why we will see movement, but we are still seeing movement in councils where we wouldn't necessarily expect movement. And in some cases, that movement is even backwards as well. So the Commission has gone through fairly extensive efforts in recent years to audit that data to some extent, to make sure that CEOs are specifically certifying that data and really diving into the data each year to make sure that councils can substantiate significant movements. And if they can't, we reject those changes. But if we can go on to the next slide, what we do believe is that there is a better way of doing this rather than an annual data spreadsheet exercise, collection exercise from each council. And what we want to move to progressively over the next few years is to move to a GIS-based system which utilises the VicMap transport database as its core. And really work with councils to improve the quality and degree of information about council's local road networks that sits on VicMap. And then once that data is sufficiently been improved and reviewed, we can then use that data as the basis for our calculations rather than having to go to councils each year. So we've been working with a group of pilot councils. We believe this is achievable. It does require some funding, which we're in the process of seeking at the moment. We believe it will have a number of advantages, not only for the Commission and councils in terms of more robust and equitable grant outcomes, but will have a range of other benefits as well in terms of improving the VicMap data set. So, John, I am going to leave it at that point for any further questions or discussion.
Thanks very much, Colin. So again, the opportunity for any questions or comments on what Colin has just spoken about.
Miguel Belmar here. I just had a question, Colin, on
Yes.
the number that you use for traffic volume. Is that a static number for that particular year of assessment, or do you do it based on the growth or reduction in traffic volume that occurs from year to year?
Thanks for that question. So each year, currently, we're asking councils two things. We're asking what is the total length of local roads for your municipality, and then distribute those across urban and rural categories, and then with each of those, distribute them across the various traffic volume ranges. So for urban local roads, for example, so again, I'm guessing at numbers, it might be, say, 1,500 kilometres for Casey. We ask that those 1,500 kilometres be distributed across the 4 traffic volume ranges. What's the total length of road carrying less than 500 vehicles a day? What's the length of road carrying 500 to 1,000, 1,000 plus, 1,000 to 5,000, 5,000 plus? That data will change each year, and we would certainly expect an increase from Casey each year, not only in terms of the total road length, but we would start to see increases in those higher traffic volume ranges as existing roads become more heavily utilised. So it is data that does change each year.
Thank you.
And Colin, could I add the most current data at the time of the collection by the Commission?
Correct.
Well, I've just got more of a comment than a question. A lot of our local road networks are actually basically being used as nearly arterial roads in the growth areas, because we're waiting on particularly state government or federal government funding to build some of these arterial roads. So what we're finding is, while the usage rates are significantly higher, the challenge we have is that the actual maintenance we require on these roads, because they're not designed to handle that capacity, is almost in sometimes meaning that the lifespan of these assets is halved. So we're finding a lot of our local roads that are, that are acting as almost arterial roads, we're having to increase the maintenance substantially, and that's coming from a rate base, and therefore we are having to prioritise over other areas of the municipality, and sort of the knock-on effect that happens with that.
Colin, you're able to address that?
Yeah, thanks for that, James. And would certainly be expecting to see those sorts of road, or that reflected in your traffic volume data, and those roads included in those higher traffic volume ranges, which attract a higher base maintenance cost per kilometre. So whilst in the example I had before was $7,200 for roads carrying under 500 vehicles a day, it's much higher for roads carrying the higher traffic volumes as well. The other thing I'd just note as well, I did mention the issue of strategic routes, and I certainly would advise council to have a close look at the classification of your roads against the strategic route definition that we provide, to make sure that roads that you would consider to be strategic routes, using those definitions. No, it's not arbitrary. It's saying if it falls into these categories, they can be classified as a strategic route. That would add to your calculation and your grant outcome as well.
I think that's the important point, James. The strategic route calculation or assessment of those roads, if they qualify, ensure that you designate them as such. Any other questions or comments?
I was just going to say thank you, because particularly over the next 3 or 4 years with all the big build, it's important for us to probably reassess that. So thank you, John.
Okay, thank you. All right. I think I might ask Michael now, Michael Albrick, just to talk briefly about the final slide, grant outcomes, and then talk about the pool of funds. So, Michael, in your hands.
Yeah, hooray, my picture's just reappeared. I'd lost it for the last half hour for somehow or other. Look, the graph there, if we could just bring up the graph, and I'm conscious of the time, so we need to be pretty quick.
Next slide, will you?
No. Okay, there we are. Okay, look, I think without going through it chapter and verse, the graph there is just a display of outcomes after we've made our recommendations to the Minister for his determination. And it shows that the population is heavily skewed to the city, obviously, but the grant outcomes are heavily skewed to the rural, the smaller rural councils. Commissions over many, many years, so successive commissions have followed this principle, I guess, of putting in place mechanisms within the methodology to support the smaller underfunded rural councils as a foremost activity. And I think the summary sentence, it says rural councils comprise only 12.6% of the population but receive 45.2% of the grant. Wouldn't be a surprise to anyone. That's not to say that we undervalue the outcomes for other councils and the shares that they should receive, which leads me to the next bigger point, I guess, and it's really the size of the pool. Commissions can grapple with the slicing and dicing of the pool for as long as they want, but will never, ever satisfy all needs. It's probably interesting for you to note, if you don't know already, that when these grants were instituted by the Whitlam government in the 1970s, the amount of funding that was made available at that time was directly tied to the collection of income tax, and it represented about 40% of the assessed need as determined by commissioners. Colin's just been through quite a detailed presentation, and the takeaway point there is that the amount of funding made available represents about 15% of assessed need. So over a 4-decade period, you've seen a diminution in the relativity of the size of the pool from about 40% of need to about 15% of need, sort of 2.5 times. That's in broad terms, of course. So if you're getting $20 million now, in Whitlam's time, you would have relatively been getting about 50 million, something like that. And that's the big picture point to make in terms of the funding that is available and is made for distribution. We're commissioners, we only slice up the pool. It's not our job to advocate, but we would urge you to consider talking to your local members of parliament and obviously other advocacy bodies about the relativity of the funding and whether more should perhaps be done in the future, if at all possible.
Thank you, Michael. Just before last opportunity for any further questions, the second question that you did give was to do with COVID and the impact on rate arrears. I don't think we actually addressed that. The Commission is certainly aware from our discussions with a host of councils that it has impacted on their rate arrears and therefore impacted on cash flow. It has clearly impacted councils differently, so it's not uniform across Victoria, but I guess the bottom line is that it's not a matter which we take into consideration in our formula, as you would have understood from Colin's presentation. So we are concerned, we understand it, but it's not one that we can take into account in accordance with the principles. Last opportunity for any questions or comments. Nothing?
No, thank you, John. Just on behalf of Casey, I think my internet's a bit unstable this morning, but on behalf of Casey, just to say thank you for your explanation today. I think it's been useful for both Miguel and I in particular, probably a refresh for most of the officers in the room. We certainly have a very strong advocacy platform, and we're very good at Casey at arguing for our needs. So picking up the point that James has made, we will most certainly continue to do that. But yeah, thank you to you and to Michael for your time today and your staff, and also thanks to the Casey staff who've done a lot of preparatory work. You can see there's a lot of really rich data that we're always able to provide, and always willing to assist the Commission should that data in any way assist your assessment of Casey's needs. So thank you for the meeting this morning.
Nolene, thank you as well, and to your team for the opportunity to talk this morning. We find it very useful, and even the little bit of discussion we've had along the way, we'll talk about that. I would encourage Casey again to think about if they'd like to formulate a submission, and they can do that individually or perhaps with another council or councils. But it is important to us, and probably all that's left to say really is thank you, and to you and to your communities in these most uncertain times. Please continue to stay safe. So thank you, and goodbye for now.
Good morning, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.